Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is super important, and that's racist microaggressions and how they affect Black women in the workplace.
Definitely a critical topic.
Yeah. So to kind of guide our conversation, we've got this really fascinating online article.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
Yeah, it's called Navigating the Workplace: The Impact of Racist Microaggressions on Black Women. And then we've also got some really powerful snippets from another podcast that I think will kind of add to our conversation.
For sure. I think those personal stories really bring it to life.
Totally. So maybe a good place to start would be to just define what microaggressions are.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes there's a little confusion.
Yeah, for sure. So it's important to remember that it's not always these blatant acts of discrimination.
Right. It's not always like those big things that make the headlines.
Yeah, exactly. They're often these subtle, almost insidious things that can just slip under the radar.
So
Yeah, and they can be disguised as compliments or jokes or even just casual observations.
oh, so true.
But underneath it all is bias.
Right. The underlying message is always one of bias.
Exactly.
In the podcast, they gave this really perfect example. I thought it was so good.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
Someone saying to a Black woman, wow, you're so articulate.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic one.
On the surface, it seems harmless,
Yeah.
even positive.
Like a compliment. But what it's really saying is, you speak so well for a Black woman.
Right. It's like there's this implied qualifier.
Exactly. And that's the bias at play.
And that diminishes her achievement.
Yeah, it reinforces that stereotype.
Which is that eloquence is somehow unexpected from a Black woman.
Exactly.
It's like a backhanded compliment.
Totally. And those little digs can have a real impact on her career.
No kidding. It's not just words.
Right. They can have real consequences.
Absolutely. So I was really struck by the point in the article where it talked about how this plays out. Say in meetings.
Oh, yeah, in a work setting.
Yeah, imagine this Black woman, she's sharing this brilliant idea and it's totally overlooked.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
But then a white colleague says literally the same thing and suddenly everyone's on board.
You're kidding?
I know, it's so infuriating.
It's like they're invisible.
Right.
And it happens all the time.
I can't even imagine.
It's this constant undermining of her authority and expertise.
And chipping away at her confidence too.
Yeah, and her ability to advance.
It's one step forward, two steps back.
Exactly. And we can't forget the historical context here.
Right. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
Absolutely. Black women have been facing this intersection of oppression for centuries.
From slavery to segregation and just the ongoing fight for equal rights. It's
a double whammy.
A double whammy, for sure. So even these seemingly small acts like those microaggressions carry this extra weight.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's heavy stuff.
It is, and it shows how deeply ingrained these biases still are.
Totally. We think we've come so far.
But we have a long way to go.
Yeah. The article had some really powerful, real-world examples that I thought really drove this point home.
I know there were some that really stuck with me.
What were some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, one was this constant pressure Black women face to justify their authority.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it.
They always have to overperform and their decisions are questioned.
Yeah, their expertise is always doubted.
It's exhausting.
I bet.
And then on the flip side, if they show too much passion or assertiveness,
then they're the angry Black woman.
Exactly.
It's they can't win.
It's this impossible tightrope walk.
Oh, the tightrope walk.
Constantly trying to navigate those expectations and biases.
It's exhausting even thinking about it.
It really is.
And then even something as personal as a woman's appearance can become an issue.
Oh, yeah. I was surprised by that, too.
Right. The article talked about how natural hairstyles are often met with disapproval or even outright discrimination in the workplace.
It's shocking, isn't it?
It is.
And these incidents might seem minor on their own, but
But think about the cumulative effect.
yeah, day after day, these microaggressions add up.
There's death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Exactly.
It creates this toxic environment that takes a toll on their well-being.
Their mental and emotional well-being.
It's definitely not water off a duck's back.
No way. It's got to be exhausting to constantly be on guard, feeling like you have to prove yourself over and over again.
Yeah, and that's where this idea of racial battle fatigue comes in.
Yes. That's a powerful term.
It is. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. So racial battle fatigue is basically the chronic mental and emotional exhaustion that Black women experience from constantly navigating these racist encounters and microaggressions.
So it's the weight of having to be on all the time.
Exactly. Code switching, constantly battling against these subtle but pervasive forms of racism.
That sounds draining.
It is incredibly draining.
Can you give us a couple of examples of how this might manifest for someone at work? Like, what does that look like?
Sure. So imagine you're in a meeting and you're constantly being interrupted or talked over. Ugh, I hate that.
Right. Your ideas are ignored
Until a white colleague repeats them.
and gets credit for your insights.
Ouch.
That feeling of invisibility, of constantly having to fight to be heard and respected,
Yeah.
it's exhausting.
And demoralizing.
It really is, and it can really chip away at a person's self-confidence.
Yeah, like you start to doubt your own ideas and abilities.
Exactly, and you start to wonder if maybe you're being too sensitive or overreacting.
But it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. The microaggressions feed the self-doubt, and the self-doubt makes it harder to push back against those microaggressions.
That's so disheartening. And it's important to remember that this isn't just about hurt feelings.
Right. This is about real consequences.
Real consequences to their careers.
Exactly. Think about how microaggressions can impact performance reviews.
Oh, that's a good point.
If a Black woman is constantly being undermined or interrupted in meetings.
It creates the perception that she's not contributing.
Exactly.
And that impacts their evaluations.
And then that affects promotions, raises
Yeah.
even job security. So these microaggressions can literally hinder their career advancement.
They can create these invisible barriers that hold them back.
Wow. This is all so much to unpack.
It is. It's a complex issue.
But I think it's so important that we're talking about it.
I agree. We need to bring these issues to light.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to dive into some potential solutions in our next segment.
Me too. There's a lot to explore there.
But before we move on, I want to hear from you, our listeners.
Yes. What are your experiences?
What are your own experiences with microaggressions in the workplace?
What challenges have you faced?
And what coping strategies have you found helpful?
Take a moment to reflect.
And we'll be right back to continue this crucial conversation.
Yeah, it's been really interesting hearing from our listeners and how much this topic is resonating with them.
Yeah, definitely. And, you mentioned this term racial battle fatigue earlier. And the podcast we listened to had some pretty vivid examples of like how that actually plays out.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Like what that looks like in the workplace.
Yeah.
It's more than just like feeling tired.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
way more than just being tired.
Right.
So imagine you're in a meeting, right? You're constantly being interrupted or talked over.
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
Your ideas are ignored until like a white colleague repeats them and then suddenly
And gets credit for them.
and gets credit for your insights.
Wow.
That feeling of invisibility, like you're constantly having to fight to be heard, to be respected. It's exhausting.
It really is. And you start to like question yourself, right?
Exactly.
Like, am I
being too sensitive?
am I overreacting?
I'm imagining things.
It really chips away at your self-esteem,
And then that makes it even harder to speak up the next time.
Exactly. It's like a trap.
Such a vicious cycle.
The microaggressions create self-doubt, and then the self-doubt makes it harder to push back against those same microaggressions.
Right, so it's like you're almost setting yourself up for more.
Yeah.
So besides like that feeling of exhaustion, are there other ways that this racial battle fatigue can manifest? Well, definitely. The podcast talked about things like increased anxiety, difficulties sleeping, even physical health problems like headaches or digestive issues.
Wow. So it can actually affect your physical health too.
Absolutely. It's like your body is constantly in fight or flight mode trying to cope with this ongoing stress.
Right. It's like your body's always on high alert.
Yeah. And that takes a toll.
So what are some ways that Black women can kind of build resilience and navigate these situations?
Well, the article talked a lot about the importance of self-care, things like mindfulness techniques, meditation, deep breathing exercises, yoga.
Those sound like good practical tips.
Yeah, it's about giving them tools to manage that stress and process those emotions.
So equipping themselves to kind of deal with this in a healthy way.
Yeah, and having that support network.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that before.
Having a group of colleagues, a mentor, a support group specifically for Black women.
Like a safe space where they can talk about this stuff.
Exactly, a safe space to be vulnerable, to share their experiences without judgment.
It's so important to feel seen and heard.
Absolutely, to know that you're not alone in this struggle.
But I feel like we can't just focus on coping mechanisms, right?
You're right.
We need to be actively working to dismantle the systems that are causing this in the first place.
100%. We need to shift from reacting to these microaggressions to preventing them.
So being proactive instead of reactive.
Exactly. And that's where allyship comes in.
I can see how that's important, but it's tricky, right? Because these microaggressions can be so subtle.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
How can allies effectively call them out without, making things worse.
Sometimes even just a simple phrase like, "That's not okay," or "I don't think that's appropriate," can make a big difference.
Yeah, it shows you're paying attention and you're not going to let it slide.
Exactly. And using your voice to educate yourself and others, becoming more aware of those subtle forms of bias.
So speaking up in the moment, educating yourself, being an active bystander.
Absolutely being an advocate.
The article also talked about the role of organizational change, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to just rely on individuals.
We need systemic solutions.
What might that look like?
Well, for starters, we need to see diversity in leadership roles, not just entry-level positions.
So having Black women represented at every level.
Exactly. And fostering an environment where everyone feels safe and empowered to speak up.
Where their concerns are taken seriously?
Yes.
I imagine that's a big shift for a lot of organizations.
It is. It requires a willingness to kind of relinquish control, to acknowledge that the best ideas often come from those who have been historically excluded.
Instead of seeing it as relinquishing control, maybe it's like expanding the pool of ideas
Oh, I love
that
that.
they can draw from.
It's recognizing that those different lived experiences, those voices that have been traditionally silenced,
It's so much to offer.
they do. And the organizations that embrace this shift, that prioritize diversity and inclusion, they're going to be the ones that thrive.
It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
Exactly.
So I've talked about allyship, we've talked about organizational change.
Yeah.
What about broader societal change?
That's a crucial piece, too. These microaggressions aren't happening in a vacuum. They're a reflection of the larger societal context.
So to really get rid of them, we need to address those underlying systemic issues.
Exactly. We need to dismantle the systems of oppression that have historically marginalized Black women and other groups.
Those are some big conversations
Yeah.
about race and power and privilege,
They're not going to be easy.
but they're necessary.
Absolutely.
Wow, this is all so thought-provoking.
It is a lot to think about.
But I think it's important that we're having this conversation.
I agree.
So before we move on to part 3, I'd love to hear from you, our listener,
What's one concrete action you can take
either in your personal or professional life,
to challenge microaggressions?
to contribute to a more inclusive and equitable environment.
Think about it for a moment.
And we'll be right back to explore some of those solutions together. Wow, some really powerful commitments there. I love that.
Yeah, inspiring to hear.
It's so true. Like, change starts with each of us. But to amplify that, right? To
Yeah.
really see those individual efforts make a difference.
Uh-huh.
What do solutions look like at like a larger scale?
Yeah.
Like, what can organizations and society as a whole do to really dismantle these systems?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, and create lasting change.
I think it's so interesting how all those levels are connected, you know?
Yeah.
Like individual actions are like the ripples, but
But for real change to happen,
organizations have to step up.
they have to be a part of it.
Can't just be reactive, they have to be proactive.
So it's more than just damage control.
Way more.
It's about building a foundation where this stuff doesn't happen in the first place.
Yeah, creating a culture that doesn't tolerate this behavior.
And that starts at the top, right?
Absolutely. Leadership is key.
We need leaders who are not only diverse, but committed to creating inclusive environments.
Not just like checking a box.
Right, not just like, oh, we have a Black woman on our leadership team, good job us.
Yeah, it has to be genuine
It's about creating space for their voices to be heard,
and valued.
making sure they're not just included, but that they have a seat at the table.
Where the decisions are being made?
I imagine that's a big shift for some organizations, though.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially those that are really stuck in those old ways of doing things.
Right, those traditional hierarchies.
It requires a willingness to let go of some of that control, you know?
Yeah.
And to recognize that sometimes the best ideas come from the people who've been historically excluded.
Yeah, maybe instead of seeing it as giving up control, it's like
Expanding the pool of ideas.
expanding the pool of ideas and experiences
Worth that.
that they can draw from.
It's recognizing that those different lived experiences, those voices that have been traditionally silenced,
They have so much to offer.
they do. And the organizations that get that prioritize diversity and inclusion, those are the ones that are going to succeed in the long run.
It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
Yeah.
So beyond leadership, what are some concrete steps that organizations can take to create this more inclusive culture?
Training is huge.
Training.
And not just like your typical diversity training.
Right.
We need programs that go beyond just defining what microaggressions are.
Give people the tools.
Yeah, to understand their impact, to understand their own biases, and to intervene effectively.
Like be an active bystander.
Yeah, be an upstander, not just a bystander.
And I imagine reporting mechanisms are important too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's not enough to just like vent to your friend.
Right. There needs to be a clear process for addressing these incidents.
And consequences for people who violate those policies.
Accountability is key.
It's like setting a standard and saying this is not okay.
Exactly. And all of this ties into a larger conversation we need to have as a society.
Oh yeah, the big picture.
About race, about gender, about power.
Right, these microaggressions aren't just happening in isolation.
They're a symptom of a much deeper problem.
So to really fix it,
We need to acknowledge those systemic issues.
we need to have those hard conversations.
The uncomfortable conversations.
About privilege, about who benefits from these systems and who's harmed by them.
It's about acknowledging the ways our society has been structured to disadvantage certain groups and then working to dismantle those systems.
And build something better in their place.
A world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
That's the dream.
It is a powerful vision.
And it might feel overwhelming, but every action we take, no matter how small,
It all adds up.
it contributes to that shift.
Speaking up, donating to organizations fighting for racial justice, educating yourself and others.
It all matters.
It all makes a difference.
It's about remembering that we have collective power. And this isn't just about Black women.
This benefits all of us.
Creating a society free from microaggressions makes the world a better place for everyone.
Absolutely. A more inclusive, more vibrant, more just world.
What a great conversation this has been.
It really has.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And a huge thank you to our expert for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks for having me.
To our listener, we hope this has sparked some new awareness and maybe given you some concrete steps you can take.
To make a difference.
Remember, even those small acts of kindness and allyship, they can create a ripple effect.
They really can.
So let's keep learning, let's keep growing, and let's work together to create a world where everyone can truly thrive.
Yes, to a better future for all of Char.